Hello ladies and gentle ladies, and welcome back to another Minecraft modding tutorial for 1.21 for Fabric. And in this tutorial we are going to be making an item, and then we'll also make a food item as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Now before we continue with this tutorial, we are briefly going to explain what we already have here, since I didn't do that in the previous tutorial. So we're just going to briefly go through some of these things that we have here. There isn't much to talk about. So basically this is your main class of the mod. So this has to implement the mod initializer class, which is what Fabric uses to determine the entry point, basically. So this is your initializing class. This is the first class in your mod that will be loaded and constructed. And this onInitialize method will actually be called as soon as Minecraft is kind of ready for mods to be loaded. But as it says in this comment here, things like resources may still be uninitialized, so you do have to be somewhat cautious with what you're doing in this method. You'll see in here that we have a logger created for us by default. So this is just logging with our mod ID. I'm actually going to do tutorial mod more like that, so that it's a little bit neater in the logs. And then I'm going to remove these comments since we don't need them. You see, this is kind of how you use the logger here. So you have info, you have warn, you have debug, you have error, and then there is also trace for any of those different ones that you want to use. I'm actually going to change this. And let me turn off Copilot, because I said I would do that in the last video, but I didn't. And I'm just going to say, we'll say mod, what should we say? Something just like loading. And that will actually print like tutorial mod loading, because that's the name of our logger here. Now, something else we should do whilst we're in here is we're going to create a constant for our mod ID, since that's going to be very useful to us in the future. So we'll just go public static final string mod ID, and you can actually do mod underscore ID. It doesn't really matter which, either is fine. And we're just going to set that to our mod ID. So mine is tutorial mod. You should remember what that is from the previous tutorial, but if you don't remember, just go into your resources and in your fabric mod.json, and you can see your mod ID is this ID field right here. It needs to be exactly the same across everything that you are doing inside of your mod. So that must always be the same. So mine is just tutorial mod, and just check that that is obviously spelt the same as well. You don't want any misspellings, otherwise that won't work. What we can go ahead and do is come into the tutorial mod data generator. Once again, as I said in the previous tutorial, you will only have this class if you selected that on the install. So don't worry about this if you don't. But basically this is exactly the same. The only difference is that this is an entry point for the data generator, so that's automatically just handled basically, and you have this onInitialize data generator method, which will take in the fabric data generator. We'll talk about that more in the actual data gen tutorial, since it's not too important for now. Then you'll see here we have a mixin package, or a folder. I like to just call them packages, because that is more so what they are. Now, mixins are effectively a really powerful tool that allows you to inject code directly into the vanilla code, which is really powerful, and as such it's also quite dangerous, so you have to be careful when you are using them. Now, I do plan to do a mixin tutorial somewhat soon, but for now you can basically just see what this does just by reading it. So you see this is mixing into the Minecraft server class. This is just what we've called the class. We're injecting at the head of this method, and then we're just getting that callback info. So once again, I'll explain this more in the mixin tutorial, but just note that basically mixins will have to be in this separate package here. If you don't want mixins, you can always just delete this and then also delete your mixin JSON here. Or if you don't want to delete the mixin JSON, you can just remove it from here, since all mixins must be placed in this array right here. But we don't need to worry about that too much, as I say. Then, since we decided to split our sources, we also have a client source set here. And it's effectively the exact same structure. The only difference is that we have a client mod initializer in here, which has on initialize client. So that's kind of when the client is initialized, and we would register, for example, renderers in here and other things like that. Then we also have the client mix-ins as well, which is going to be effectively the exact same. So now let's go ahead and move on. So what we can do is we can create a new package inside of our main package. And by the way, when I refer to the main package, I'm going to be referring to dev.30worty.tutorial mod. So that is our main package. Yours may not be that. Yours may be, for example, space dudes dot space mod, or whatever, right? But mine is dev.30worty.tutorial mod. And in here, I'm going to create a new package for Init. So if you are kind of new to the understanding of how Minecraft works, effectively everything must be added to a registry, and effectively what we call that is either registration, or what I like to call it is just initialization. So you can call this package whatever you want. I've decided to call it Init because that's short for initialization. It's just easier to have it as Init, in my opinion. But feel free to obviously call it whatever you want. You can call it registry, for example, if you wanted. That's fine. Init is what I'm going to be going with, so I'm going to name it back to Init. And inside of here we have basically all of our classes for initialization. So we're going to start with items in this tutorial. So as such, we're going to create an item in it. Another common name for this class may be something like mod items. Or you may also see sometimes something like tutorial mod items. So basically the name of your mod and then items is also relatively common. So those are basically the three main ones you will see. Item Init is what I always use. That's what I've always used. So it doesn't matter. As I say, you can call it whatever you want as long as you know that this is your class to initialize items. And likewise, if you're doing blocks, you would create a block in it. If you're doing entities, you could create an entity in it. Well, you'd actually create an entity type in it, but we'll obviously get to that eventually. And in here, we basically just initialize an item. So before we actually create an item, I do want to show you something very important that you will need to use a lot throughout your modding quote-unquote journey, as you could say. So if you double press shift or triple press maybe, I forget which one to be honest, you can then tick this checkbox here for include non-project items. And what you can put in here is you can search for things. So I can search for items. And you see this shows basically all of the vanilla classes and Java classes and whatever with this name in it. So you'll see the items class here. And this will just take a second to decompile. And you'll see basically these are all of the vanilla items, right? So these are all of the vanilla items, all registered in there. So effectively we just need to do the exact same thing as this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a we're actually going to create a method that will allow us to register an item first, since that will simplify this process a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go public static, and then we're going to make this method generic. So we're going to say t extends item, and you need to make sure you import item from net.minecraft.item, and this method is going to then return that t, and then we're just going to do register item, or we can actually just call this register because it's in the item in it, so it's obviously going to register items. Then this is going to take in a name, so we'll just do string name, and then what we're going to do is pass in an item dot settings, which will be the settings. Instead of passing in the settings, what we will do instead is pass in t, which will be the item, like that. We'll do that instead, just to keep this a little simpler. So then what we'll do in here is we will return registry, and you need to make sure you import the one from net.minecraft.registry, not from org.apache or from Java RMI. So make sure you import the correct one there. You want to do registry.register. We then need to pass in the actual registry that we want to register it to. So for that, we need to do a registries dot, and then we can do item, and that needs to be uppercase. Then we can actually pass in the identifier. So effectively, this will be the name of your item. And we're going to leave that for a second because we're going to create our own method to do that. And then we're just going to pass in the actual item. So we need to create an identifier here, and we can actually do that by saying identifier.of, and then it needs a namespace and a path. So for our namespace, that is effectively your mod ID. So we're going to say tutorial mod.mod ID, because remember we made that constant in there. Then we need to give it the name. Now we're going to need to do this kind of thing a lot throughout our mod, so I'm actually going to create a method that will simplify this for us. So I'm going to come back into our main class, and in here I'm going to create a public static identifier, and we're just going to call this method ID, is what I like to call it. Nice and short and simple, and we'll just say a string, and we'll call this the path. And then what we'll do is return identifier.of. We're going to pass in our mod ID and then the path. So effectively that means that we can just do tutorial mod. So we can change this to tutorial mod.id, and then we can remove the mod ID in here and it will just be the name. So that's a lot simpler to just do it that way. Then we can actually go ahead and use this method to register our item. So let's go with a public static final item, and we are going to call this whatever you want to call your item, basically. So mine is going to just be an example item, so I'm literally just going to call it example underscore item. And remember that this should be upper snake case because this is a static final, so this is a constant, so it should be upper snake case. And then that will be equal to, and we'll call our register method. Then we're going to give it the name of the item. So this name should always be lowercase. It cannot have any spaces and it cannot have any special symbols. So just letters, numbers, underscores, and I believe dashes are fine too. So we're just going to put the name of our item, which is going to be example item. And it is generally recommended that you try keep this name here the same as this. Obviously not the same case, because this needs to be uppercase and this needs to be lowercase, but it should be the same name effectively. So we'll just call that example item. And then what we're just going to do is pass in a new item. And inside of this item, we need to provide it with an item.settings. So for that, we're just going to do a new item.settings. And that is it. We have now registered an item. I think I'm missing a bracket there. There you go. So if we run this, you'll see something happens, maybe not what you expect. So we're actually going to run it now, and I'll show you what happens here. And whilst this is running, you will see here that this class is never used, right? So it says that this class is never used, and this field is also never used. And that is because we're not calling this class, so nothing is ever happening to this class. So when we load the game does not even know that this class exists, because it's never being accessed, it's never being used. So what we actually need to go ahead and do is make sure we load this class so that basically all of the fields in here are initialized, and therefore it will actually call this method and this class will be loaded. So if we run the game and we just come into a world that we have here and we try and /give our item, you'll see that we don't actually get anything. So if we do /give and write test mod or tutorial mod, sorry, s tutorial mod, nothing comes up basically. So we need to go ahead and actually load that class. And how do we do that? Well, the easiest way is just to create a method that will do nothing, but it will load it. So the way you generally do that is just a public static void. Since we don't need to return anything, this method will literally just load the class. And I just like to call this init, or load is also fine. I'll call it load. And this method is literally going to do nothing. So that is a blank method. And all we need to do is inside of our main tutorial mod class, so inside of our main class, we can do it above the logger or below the logger. It doesn't really matter. I will do it below the logger. So I'll say item init dot load. And you'll see that if we now come into here, that this is now used, and it says no usages. That's not true. If we close and reopen it, it should show up. There you go. So you see that that is now used inside of here. And if we now go ahead and run the game, we will now have this item inside of the game. And obviously this will not be added to any creative tab or anything like that. We'll get to that in probably not the next tutorial, but the one afterwards. But effectively, this should be fine. Whilst this game is loading, actually it's loaded already, so let's just quickly test that this has actually worked, and then we'll move on to food. But there are some things that we still do need to do, and you'll see what that is in a second. So if I give myself, I keep trying to type test mod, tutorial mod, there you go, and you'll see we actually do have an item in the game. So basically, boom, we've now added our own item, but you'll see there's obviously a few issues with it. So first of all, it's a big purple and black box, right? And it also has this weird name, right, which isn't very useful. And yeah, I mean, that's not great, right? We want it to actually look like, you know, for example, redstone dust, right? We want it to actually look good and to have an actual name. So in fact, we'll do that first, and then we'll create a food afterwards. So we'll try and keep it together. So you'll see here we have our resources package, or source set, it technically is. And basically this is where all your mods resources are. So your assets will be in here, and any of your data is in here. So inside of here we have assets.tutorialmod, and effectively what this is this is a resource pack. So this is a resource pack that is bundled into your mod. So this is our resource pack, since it is using our mod ID as the identifier. And if we had, for example, data.tutorialmod, that would be a data pack that is bundled inside of our mod. So inside of here we're going to create a new directory. And this will be for the lang, since we'll do the name first. Now inside of the lang, we need to create a new file, and this needs to be a JSON file, and this will be for the specific language that you want to translate to. So the default for kind of like English would be en_us.json. And you'll see that shows up as an actual language file there. That might be though because I have the mod dev plugin installed, which I will talk about in a future tutorial, but your icon might not be exactly the same as mine. And in here you basically just do your translation, right? So the translation would be item dot, and then your whatever your mod ID is. So our mod ID is tutorial mod, and then dot example underscore item, since that's what we called our item. Remember, in here it is example underscore item. That needs to be exactly the same, and we can just call this whatever we want. So, you know, example, oops, if I could type, of course, example item, boom, and that will work. And obviously this is going to complain because, oh yeah, it's a typo. We can always save that to the dictionary if we want. Okay, then we need to actually create a model, since obviously items can have different models. So we're going to want to create a new directory inside of the base of our resource pack. So we're just going to create models, and that needs to be plural. It's very important that you get all of these names exactly correct. By the way, for language, if you wanted to do another language, you could do, for example, a new file, and say you wanted to do French, you would do fr_fr, so that's like France French. I guess you could also do like FR underscore like CA, which I think would be like Canadian French. And you would just add these in here. So it would be basically exactly the same. So you would do item.tutorialmod.example item. And then, you know, whatever the translation of that is in French. I don't know enough French to tell you. And you would just do that basically. So then inside of our models, we want to create a new directory, and this will be item. That is not plural, so that is just item, not items. We'll create that in there, and you'll see that changes to models.item. Don't worry about that. That is just IntelliJ collapsing it basically. There is a way to, in the tree appearance here, you can make it not do that. So if I don't do collapse middle packages, you'll see it doesn't do that. I do prefer though to just compact the middle packages, because otherwise other things also show like that, which is a bit of a pain really. And here you basically just create a new file, which will need to be the exact name of your item. So once again, example underscore item, and that will be a .json file. And then inside of here, what we need to do is we need to say first the parent of this model. So the parent that we are going to be using is Minecraft:item/generated, and that is effectively just going to be the default translations and transformation for this model. And then we're just going to say the textures. Okay, and that is a JSON object. And then inside of here, we're going to say that layer 0, which is just the default layer basically, will be wherever our texture is located. So we first need to say our mod ID, so tutorial mod, colon, and then we're going to say item slash, and then whatever the name of our texture would be. So ours is going to be exactly the same name, since we don't want to have any more complicated than that. And we'll just leave it like that. So it's very important that you don't have the .png in there. It will just be example item. It already knows it's going to be a PNG, so we don't need to specify that ourselves. And then let's create the texture. So let's go into here, create a new directory. This will be for textures. Then we'll create a new directory again, which will be for item. You see, once again, that just collapses like that, but we don't need to worry about that. And then what we can do is just drag our texture into here. So I'm going to be lazy, and I'm just going to use the exact same texture that I used for the 1.20 tutorials, which is this one. Just note, for textures, it needs to be a PNG, and it needs to be, well, it doesn't need to be, but it should be a power of 2. Ideally, just 16 by 16 is fine. And I'm also going to actually drag this one into there as well, since we're going to use this one in a second. So let's close that. We don't need that anymore. And let's create a food before we actually go run the game. We'll create a food first. So let's go with a public static final. This will once again still just be an item. And I'm just going to call this an example food. Example food. No, we'll just call it example food, just to keep it simple. And then we'll go register. This is going to be example underscore food. And actually, I needed to rename my texture, didn't I? Since I copied them across. Let's make sure we do that, because obviously that does need to be the exact same name. Otherwise, we're going to get some texture errors. So I'm going to rename these example food. There we go. Okay. Then we're just going to once again do a new item. Nothing special there. Then we're still going to do a new item.settings. Okay. And that's all we need to do for that. But obviously, how do we actually make it a food? Well, that's what these settings are for. So these settings allow us to provide information about this item. And that's basically going to be allowed for all items. So you'll see here we can make it a food. We can add attribute modifiers. We can add specific components. We can make it fireproof. We can give it a max count. We can make a jukebox playable. We can give it max damage, rarity, all of these different things. But we're going to be adding a food. So I'm actually going to put this new item on its own line here. I'm going to say .food. Now in here we need a food component. So we're actually going to create a new class that will allow us to have all of our food settings inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this food list. In fact, no, we'll leave this for a second. We'll actually go ahead and create the class first. So I'm just going to collapse some of our packages there. And I'm going to create a new package inside of our main package. And I'm just going to call this package list. And then inside of here, I'm going to create a new class, which will be the food list. And the reason I'm calling it a list instead of an init is because we are initializing, we are initializing a field, but the difference with this is that we are not going to be registering it. And generally, when you call something init, it's more so that you are actually registering something. So you're initializing it. You're actually initializing the object to be registered. Whereas with a list here, what we're going to be doing is just initializing the actual field. So it's a little bit different. It's not quite the same, which is why I've put it in its own package. You can, call it food init if you want. Once again, it doesn't really matter. But we're just going to call this public static final. And this will be a food component. And once again, you can see there that there is the food components class. So if we actually control click on that class, this will show you all of the vanilla ones in here. So if you wanted to look at those, you can. But we're just going to call this a food component. And this will be basically whatever you want to call this, so whatever it's for. Mine is, for example, food. So I'm just going to call this example food settings is what I'm going to call this. You can also just call it, I guess, example food component. Once again, this should be upper snake case, by the way, because this is a constant. Example food component, I guess, probably makes more sense. So let's call it that. And then let's do that is equal to a new food component dot builder. And then we can say all of these different things. So we can say the nutrition, which is how much actual hunger it will give you. You can give it the saturation, which is how much saturation it will give you. You can give it the status effects, what it could convert to when you use it, whether or not it's a snack, which is basically whether or not it eats really fast. Always edible as well, is meaning you can eat it in, say, like creative, for example, I believe. I thought there was also one for meat, but maybe not. I guess we can look at actually vanilla here, can't we? So we can go food components, and if we look at, say, maybe beef, there doesn't actually seem to be anything that specifies that it is for animals. So I'm not sure how it actually defines that anymore. Interesting. I'm not sure. So yeah, because there's no meat. That's interesting. That's definitely something that has changed. But anyways, we can provide a nutrition here. So this is basically how many half drumsticks it would be. So for example, if you wanted a full drumstick, this would be 2. If you wanted 2 full drumsticks, it would be 4. If you wanted 1.5, it would be 3. So we'll just say 4, just to keep it simple. It doesn't really matter. Then we can give it a saturation modifier. So this is always a little confusing in terms of like how much it is. I believe 1 is full saturation, but you can mess around with it, just see, is it what you want it to be. I'm just going to say like 0.3. It doesn't really matter, as I say. And I'm going to make this always edible as well. And then just to show you, we're also going to use a status effect. So this needs a status effect instance. So we could just do a new status effect instance. Then we can do status effects, and then you can choose whichever one you want, or obviously a custom one as well is fine. I'm going to just do absorption. It doesn't really matter. Then we need to give it the duration. Now this is the time in ticks, so it's important to remember that obviously Minecraft has 20 ticks in 1 second. So if we wanted, for example, 30 seconds, we would need to do 20 times 30, right, to give us that correct number. If we wanted it for a minute, we would do 20 times 60, and obviously you can directly put that value in there if you want. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter. I'll just do 20 times 30 like that. And then it wants the amplifier, which is basically the level. I'm just going to say a level 1. Then finally you have a float, which will be the chance of getting this effect. So maybe you only want it on, say, a 50% chance, you would put 0.5f. If you wanted it 100% of the time, you would say 1.0f. If you never wanted it to happen, which doesn't really make sense, because if you never wanted it to happen, then you just wouldn't add it in the first place. Anyways, if you never wanted it to happen, you would just put 0, right? I'm going to put something like 0.75, just so we can actually test that it does happen. And then finally, we just need to do .build. And that will go ahead and build that into the food component instead of a food component.builder. Okay, then what we can do is just add that in here. So food list dot example food component. Now I'm actually curious, is there like a meat thing on this, or like no? So I'm actually very curious how vanilla does that nowadays. We can actually once again go ahead and look in the items class and see possibly, for example, if we look for maybe beef, and we'll go down here to where it's actually set. So here you go. I don't know. Actually, that's really weird. My assumption is that maybe this is now something like a tag, maybe. So there's maybe a tag for like wolf food, I guess. That's my assumption. I'm actually not entirely sure. We're not going to be creating a wolf food, so it doesn't really matter for us. I will leave something in the description if I find out how you do that. Now, I'm assuming it's probably a tag. Is probably how you do that now, which does make sense, to be fair. And what we now need to do, once we've done that, since that's kind of all we want to do, we can also, I guess, add something else. So we can just say maybe we'll just say it has a max count of 16. I don't know, just to keep it different. There you go. We also need to do the lang, of course. We need to do the model, and obviously the texture if you haven't done that. So we'll come into resources, assets, lang. We're going to add another one. So we'll say item.tutorialmod.example_food, which will be example food. Obviously keep that exactly the same name. Then we're going to create a model. Oops. I'm just going to copy what we already have and just rename this one, since it's going to be exactly the same. So example_food, and then obviously you need your texture as well, which we already have the texture there, since I've already gone ahead and added that. And now what we can go ahead and do is run the game, and we should see that it works. Now if we go ahead and /give, we can do tutorial mod. I keep typing it. No, @s. Okay, tutorial mod. There you go. So we can now give example item, and then we can also give example food. There you go. And you'll see that it obviously has the correct name there. And then it's also, you know, an item, just like a normal item. And if we see that this one only stacks to 16, since that's what we set the max count to. And we can also eat this one. So if we go ahead and eat it, and if we eat it a few times, you'll see that we get our absorption there. That's actually very interesting. Why it's given us absorption 2. Didn't we say to give it absorption 1? We did. We said the amplifier should be 1. That probably means that if you wanted absorption 1, maybe you would just put in 0. That's probably how that works, if I had to guess. But we'll just use 1. Once again, it doesn't really matter. But you'll see that that was only at a 75% chance because we didn't get it the first time. And also, if we go in survival, so game mode survival, you'll see we can eat it even though we're not hungry. If we eat it again, we should be able to see that, yeah, we get the absorption. And we get the hearts down there as well, which is nice. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Obviously, I hope you found it useful. In the next tutorial, we'll be covering blocks, so we'll make our own block. And then in the tutorial after that, we will do some data gen. And then after that, we'll get started with creative tabs as well. Yeah, I will see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.